Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 36th Sustainable Agriculture Conference from the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association. My name is Mary Beth Miller, CFSA's Education Coordinator, and you have joined the session Learning Your Circle, Regenerative Production Instead of Linear Input Systems with William Metz of Metz Organix. Please feel free to use the chat to put any comments or questions you have, and will address those throughout his session, and we'll take some questions at the end. And now I'm going to hand it over to Will.
Hey everyone, I hope everybody's doing well and enjoying the conference. I just want to say thank you to the CFSA for being a large part of what I do and a large part of what so many others do. So I basically, a lot of you are probably wondering, who am I? So I basically got into farming in 2014. We had family land, and my dad was suffering from prostate cancer at the time, and he fully believed that it was due to agricultural chemicals and processed foods he'd been exposed to. And so it inspired me to provide a cleaner, more sustainable food system for our community. So out of that, I formed my farm, Metz Organix, and began on the path of learning. By trade, I went to Lander University here in Greenwood and got an economics and finance degree. No prior knowledge of farming. Everything I've learned has kind of been on my own. So I did a lot of farm training and different things starting out, and basically learned, all the wrong ways to do things. But we'll get into that here in 1 second. So there, I advanced it. Did that work, Mary Beth? Are we still good?
Okay. They're all good. All good.
Can you hear me, Mary Beth?
Yep, you sound good.
Okay, all right. I just can't see anything. That's weird. Anyway, okay. There. Is it working now on the share screen?
Yep, it's working.
Okay. All right. So I've learned through experience, and it inspired me to make a deeper connection with what I was doing and start learning better ways of production and stuff as a regenerative farmer. And once I began on that path in about 2016, early 17, I began to meet some very key important people, and I've had the opportunity to be participants in different grants and research that both Clemson and University of South Carolina are doing on the regenerative side of things. I've had the opportunity to work with Dr. Shruti Narakutty from Clemson and Dr. Bhupender from Clemson, as well as Buzz Kloot from USC and Gabe Keeney and some of their projects. And through these things, I've learned many things, and I'm constantly learning every day. I don't know everything, but things that I have learned, I'm willing to share with people because most of the time there was a very costly lesson involved with that learning process. The Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, I first made contact with them in 2016, and Mark Dempsey helped me do a CAP 138 transition to organic farm plan, which encompassed a whole array of natural resource conservation practices and grant funding that has helped me along the way greatly. So thank you, Mark, for that. So now moving on here. So by definition, people say regenerative agriculture, and it's kind of a buzzword, and it's a buzzword that is not widely accepted by the industry, especially from politicians and different things. You start talking about regenerative agriculture and climate change, they shut you out really quickly. So, I just want to look at the definition, what it means to be regenerative, and then the definition of agriculture. That's provided by Google. And I used Google because, that's the first thing the mass majority of everybody's going to use is go on Google and type in something. So anyway, regenerative means the ability to or tending to regenerate, to regrow, or be renewed or restored, especially after being damaged or lost. The act or process of regenerating is regeneration. And then the definition of agriculture, the science or practice of farming, including cultivation of the soil for growing of crops and the rearing of animals to provide food, wool, and other products. And see, I have a problem with this because by definition, of agriculture on Google, it says it includes the cultivation of the soil, and it should really, truly be all about the soil and then how to make withdrawals out of that and caring for the soil. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is just how to do that. So a little bit of info. I found an article that I liked very much and thought I would share a snippet. And there's a link down here. I can have Mary Beth email this information to you if you're interested. But on the farm, owners perceive a financial risk in adopting new practices. They grow up with the dominant conventional narrative that profits are solely tied to yields. But while regenerative farming may well produce lower yields, that does not necessarily equate to lower profits. In fact, a recent study found that farms with regenerative practices were 78% more profitable than those with only conventional practices. Regenerative farmers can give up some yield if it means making more profits, which regenerative agriculture makes possible by growing higher margin crops and reducing costly inputs. And then it goes on to talk about Gabe Brown, and I've had the opportunity to meet and talk to Gabe through Buzz Clute and Gabe and their Cover 5 project that I was involved in. And that was just a huge, huge turning point for me, being able to interact with him. And he's willing to help everybody. He has several programs that help people. His Soil Health Academy and Understanding Ag, are great programs. I haven't done them yet, but it's on my list of things to do. So when we think about, conventional systems of agriculture, most things happen. Well, we're going to cover a couple topics in this. So we're going to cover what a linear system is, and then what a circular, more regenerative system is. How do you put together the components or where to find them, and then identifying byproducts of implementation of regenerative agriculture, which is going to be the products you produce. And then something that's a little newer to me, but oftentimes we miss because we're so wrapped up in our own farms and what's going on, and because it is a very time demanding thing, as anybody who's growing anything may know. It takes a lot of time. But I've really spent this past year trying to apply this concept to my human relationships and the community here. And so far, it seems to be working pretty well. I've made some pretty significant strides over this past year, and I just want to share that with you all. So the status quo in conventional agriculture is linear systems. So the soil is considered just a substrate, dirt. It's, not really living because it's constantly tilled and constantly fumigated and sprayed and so on and so forth. They place the nutrients for the plants in the soil as inputs. Fertilizer, they have to buy a lot of fertilizer. They also lose a lot of soil through cultivation and tillage practices, and inverting the soil. They lose a lot of biodiversity. And once crops are growing, they really hit it hard, and these crops get sprayed significantly. And they're constantly fighting nature in conventional agriculture. And it has a very short-term attitude, of basically, we're producing this crop and it's going to take 4 months and it needs X, Y, and Z and to get there. And, they're not thinking about what are we going to be doing 10 years from now necessarily, and what's our soil going to be like at that point. So in regenerative agriculture, those are more along the things we think of. Linear system, they kill everything in the field, round up whatever it takes to get rid of all the weeds and everything there. It looks like a desert and then they plant it. And then they have to spend, many, many gallons of water just to get the seeds to germinate and begin growing. And there's not necessarily a whole lot of organic matter present to keep that water there and retain it. And then they have to constantly fertilize because there is no nutrients in the soil, and they have to cultivate and spray and deal with diseases and pest control very significantly. And after struggling through all of that and spending tons of money, they harvest, and then the farmer doesn't make any money. So it's a lose-lose system to me. The environment's losing, the farmer's losing, everything's losing in my eyes as far as soil health is concerned. So when you start looking at regenerative farming, the goal of regenerative farming is to rebuild the soil. Well, in terms of numbers, to rebuild soil, you really have to focus on being carbon positive. So bringing carbon waste onto the farm is low-cost ways of sequestering carbon, using cover crops to capture atmospheric carbon, the usage of leaves if you have trees available on the property. The atmospheric carbon is drawn down and stored in those leaves, and we can process that back into a usable product in the ground. I think of it as a bank. I'm constantly making deposits in my carbon bank, and I make withdrawals in the forms of my byproducts or crops. The concept I follow is if the soil is healthy and biodiverse and it has plenty of organic matter and carbon in it, then the only thing left to do is plant a seed. If the soil's where it needs to be, it's going to retain enough moisture to sustain that crop through dry periods, through wet periods. There's some exceptions in there, like if you're using a high tunnel or something, you're going to have to supplement irrigation, obviously. But that seed is the last portion of the process, and you make a withdrawal out of your carbon bank. You convert that carbon into a protein, whether it be a plant-based protein or a animal-based protein, and then that's available to humans. So by nurturing this carbon cycle and the process of carbon, all of the things that come out of it are just considered byproducts. It can provide multi-level functionality, as we'll look at, and as I said, an incredible resilience for drought or flood or wet or rainy issues. So here's just a visual. So some of my carbon inputs that I've used, cover crops, leaves, wood mulch, grass clippings, and cardboard. And I'll talk a little bit more about these things here in just a few minutes. So here's an example of one of my systems that I use. And this is derived from rotting hay bales. So at the end of every year in the springtime, you can go to your neighbors. I basically just ride along the road and if I see hay bales sitting there, I'll go and have a conversation with the neighbors and see, if they treated it with the fields with anything, because if it was treated with something, I don't necessarily want it. I can't use it for my organic egg production. But more times than not, the farmer is just letting the fields grow and then just baling it every year, and then letting these things sit there. So I first talked to the farmer about not baling the hay and wasting it every year, and then I take their waste and I put it back to use. So I've started this process this past spring, and I just essentially put the hay bale in there with the chickens, and I have a little barrier, and they process down this hay bale over time, and they don't require as much feed as you would normally have to give them. And I do, they eat grass and the bugs and the other things out here on the, the other side. They constantly are foraging and different things. And so out of this system, we're accomplishing a couple things. First of all, we're taking a carbon byproduct in the form of rotten hay bales, and we're processing it down into a usable form of compost. The second thing that comes out of this, and that compost can be used for multiple things. So, you can use it for your crops. You can sell it to friends, neighbors, anybody who needs a good source of compost. So that's one stream there. The other stream that comes out of this is, of course, eggs. We get good, fresh, nutrient-dense eggs out of this, and in our new store, I mean, we've sold upwards of 12 dozen eggs a day. So, it's a very good little source of income there off of that. And then the other part of this is we have a breeding program where we are crossing white rock hens with barred rock roosters. This is the second generation. So we did barred rock barred rock hens crossed with a dark Cornish rooster initially, and it gave us 4 phenotypes. And then we purchased white rock hens and brought them into the mix. And so this is the second part of the breeding cycle to develop a broiler bird. So out of this singular system based off of waste, we're accomplishing, we're getting compost, nutrition for future crops and to place into that carbon bank. We're getting eggs. And we also have our broiler, a source of broiler chicks where we can save money and have a higher quality bird to put on pasture, because I run chicken tractors on my pastures as well. So this is just one example of a multifunction type of component for my system. So we're going to cover, identifying different ways for you individually, and some things that may help you out, and then we'll spend a decent amount of time answering questions if there are any. So moving on here. So we're going to talk a little bit about sourcing these components. So the first thing I did when starting this is I basically did an on-farm carbon assessment. What do I have on the farm right now that is sequestering atmospheric carbon? And so I had grass, plenty of grass clippings in areas that aren't used for grazing and different things that you can collect. And from time to time, I use multiple different sources because I don't want to rely too heavily on any one single thing. So I also have, my land. I'm truly blessed to have 60 acres of land here on the farm, and 28 acres of that is field space and 40 acres is timber. But I only utilize very small portions of that. My market garden is a 6-acre field, but I only use a quarter to a half acre for production at any given one time because I'm rotating and moving animals and doing different things out there. Leaves are a big source for me. So leaves and grass clippings, you got green and browns there. Without any animals, you can mix those two things together at the right portion and make a usable compost product to put into your growing beds and feed your vegetable production, or use it to amend, your fields where your livestock is going to be grazing if you want to use it for that. There's just many uses. You can make compost tea and put it on things and whatnot through that. But neighbors, so the hay bales, the wasted hay bales or rotting hay bales, and hay bales that's been sitting there for 2 or 3 years, a chicken can break one of those down in a few weeks, depending upon how many chickens you have. Another huge carbon source that I've identified, when I started farming, I picked up using plastic mulch, and I used plastic mulch for the first 2.5 years I was farming before I figured out how detrimental it is to the soil around here. We have a silty clay loam based soil, but once you start cultivating it, the silt, the good part that keeps it loamy, washes away, and then you're left with just red clay particles there. And so that's kind of sort of what happened to me. I basically ruined my topsoil and learned a hard lesson from that. So I sold the plastic mulch layer, and I began to use cardboard more so in my walking paths and mulching those with wood chips. So I targeted restaurants first. Well, one of my primary produce customers is a brick oven pizza place. So I targeted that restaurant to collect their cardboard and was just astonished by the amount of cardboard produced by this one entity. I mean, I started collecting and it became more than what I could deal with. So I began focusing on some other sources for cardboard to use for weed control. Now I target furniture stores and big box stores because they have appliances that come in giant boxes. So these giant boxes are much easier to deal with than a million smaller boxes. But nevertheless, you can utilize either one for different purposes. Um, the furniture boxes are big and long and can cover wide areas. The little boxes from the restaurants are great for doing walking paths with. Um, I also contacted every local tree service in our area and made a short list of which ones grind up their tree matter, and I started just allowing them to come and bring me their shredded mulch. Um, and so those are outside sources of carbon, but they're free. They're all free. They cost me absolutely nothing except a little bit of time to go and pick up cardboard once a week. And most of the time, it's a multifunctional thing. I'm delivering produce to the restaurant and getting their cardboard while I'm there. So it's not like a special trip or anything. It literally involves like 10 or 15 minutes of loading and then unloading the stuff when I get back to the farm. So bringing all this carbon onto the farm, I've been doing it now for a year, and I'm just hugely carbon positive on the farm at this point. I've brought in several more tons of carbon that I'm putting out through products in an attempt to regenerate that soil, rebuild the organic matter, and feed my system that is spurred from the soil. So these are some sources for your carbon. It's pretty easy to get your hands on and to figure out there. Between the carbon that I derive from the farm and these outside resources, it's more than enough to do what I need to do. So then the other thing becomes, okay, now I've got all this carbon matter. How do I process it and break it down? Well, so the chickens are one way. I also utilize another method on my farm with rabbits and a vermiculture bed. So I basically use the carbon, I break it down with chicken manure and sources of nitrogen. And then once it's broken down, I use that to grow food for my rabbits, and then I feed my rabbits, and then my rabbits feed my worms. And out of that system, we're getting tons of different things there. We're getting vermicompost tea, a steady source of rabbit meat, and the worms. You can sell the worms to local businesses that sell worms for bait. So, out of that system, there's 3 more products that just aren't, many people aren't supplying that demand that's there. So how do you learn which withdrawals from your carbon circle are right for you, so to speak? So, whether it be vegetables or something else, eggs, broiler chickens, chicks, because we sell the baby chicks too. Um, uh, you know, Basically you have to do an assessment of what's already happening locally. So, you can reach out to you go to your local farmers market. Probably many people that are producing are already members of their local farmers markets. And just really see what's already being supplied and making you a list of items that aren't supplied, and then figure out how to process that carbon out of your circle into those products. That's kind of how I think about it. So I'm filling gaps of production that I notice within our local food system. you have to just reach out into the community and learn what those demands are there. So most recently this past year, in developing new systems on the farm and doing different things, in my community, I realized just how there was such a lack of knowledge about good food and how it's produced and different things. I started on a path of education, and the first step in that for me was to have a presence and a storefront and a constant place where people can come and gather information and source good, clean, local products altogether. I realized this doesn't work for everybody, or may not work for everybody or fit in everybody's situation, but having a local shelf or offer them for sale is a really critical thing. For the last 6 years, I've done 2 farmers markets a week, every week, and they were both 4-hour markets. And it really takes 12 hours a day. And so to do those 2 farmers markets literally took 24 hours out of my week, which is a lot of stress, just to go to a market. To number one, you have to grow every suffer from sitting out on a table for half the day instead of being refrigerated like it's supposed to be. Anyhow, for a lot of things, some things maybe not, but yeah. So it's just a lot, and it takes a lot of resources and a lot of time and effort to do that. So using using your circle to supply those direct market needs will form relationships with many people locally, your farmers market, other producers and things, and then to talk to your other fellow producers, and instead of it being a competitive situation, learn how you can complement one another. Ask them where they're getting their fertilizer from, ask them where they're getting their things from, and offer a more local, possibly lower cost or collaborative solution, where they might provide you with one thing and in turn you give them something else, through the bartering system. And over time, you will develop a community of people that are all working together. And so this creates this same symbiosis, in the carbon cycle between you and your human relationships and where your products are going and how things are being utilized back into the community. And as always, one of the easiest sources is just recycling waste back into your carbon cycle for your farm and reincorporate it back into your soil or use it to feed some of your animals and whatnot. When you implement a system like this, you're cutting out a lot of this infrastructure and a lot of direct cost. You don't have to buy as much fertilizer. You can begin to keep and save your own seeds, so your seeds costs go down. And through regenerative methods, you can lower your insecticide and pesticide costs as well as your fuel bill. So, for example, I made a conscious decision. I have about 10 acres that I've been maintaining since I was about 13 years old. That's directly surrounds our house, directly surrounds, just visible areas to people. And I've just spent thousands of dollars on fuel and thousands of hours of time trying to maintain these. And something struck me like a lightning bolt this past year. It's like, why am I doing this? And I could only come up with one simple answer. It's like it's appealing to humans. It pleases the eye, but it serves no effective purpose to nature. It serves no effective purpose in what I was doing and the mission I was trying to accomplish. And so I just quit mowing grass. For the last 2 years, I've really just not mowed grass until it's just pertinent. So I mow my high traffic areas, like right around my greenhouses and my dwellings and my structures, like about a 25-foot strip around those areas, stays maintained, and then everything else I just let grow, and I mow it other air, like along my electric fence lines and along those, I'll do those like once a month. And then the other ones, less used areas that I don't have animals in, or I did have animals and it just needs to be topped like once every 12 months, once every 18 months. So my fuel bill literally went from last year being about $3,000 the 2 years ago being about $3,000 on the farm to now this year I spent $160 this whole season on fuel, and for farm production. So it can make a large impact just in making some of these decisions. And then what I discovered in not mowing areas that surround my high tunnels or my production areas and different things, it creates a more stable habitat. And then the lower amount you disturb your soil, it just creates a more stable habitat. So if the plants are healthy, there's a measure you can use that's called a Brix score, and you determine this using a refractometer, what your Brix count is in your plants. And there's been research done, and it shows, when your Brix count is at a certain point, insects and disease can't overcome that. And so there's different levels of Brix in which you'll see different types of pests. And there's a good bit of information out there on this now. And so your Brix is how you judge your soil health. And so the healthier and more bioactive and rich your soil is, the healthier your plants are going to be and the less susceptible to the insect and disease pressures they're going to be, which subsequently lowers your input cost as far as insecticides and pesticides go. I've used BT on the farm. In a couple extreme cases, I have a percentage threshold of 15%. So like if I have a 100-foot row and 100-foot row of tomatoes and 15 feet of that row are infested with cutworms, then I will treat it. So I've only had to do that 4 times this whole season. I grow indeterminate varieties of tomatoes that are planted in April, and I just pulled my last tomatoes yesterday. So over this whole basically 7 months, I've sprayed 4 times BT 4 times at the minimum rate, because I just had to knock them back a little bit to make sure I got my tomato production to fill my orders with. But in prior years, it was like when I kept everything mowed and kept everything immaculate and kept everything perfect, I've had to spray once a week, in prior years. And so to see that, difference just over a year or so, maybe a little more now, but it's just incredible, net gains and profits. I've had lower revenue, but my profit margins are much, much higher using these systems. And that article that is in that link, that's what Gabe Brown talks about and helps people to learn. And that's where I learned. So he is a very great resource, along with all of the support network there that's helped him collect the data. Dr. Ray Archuleta from the NRCS has been very key in helping him with that. So there's plenty of resources out there. Let's see, at this time, that's the end of my slides. And I just, if there's anybody in here, I just kind of want to open it up to some discussion. If there's any questions or concerns or any direction I can help point people in. So, Mary Beth, is there any questions from anybody at all? If you're in there. Let's see. Hey there.
Let's see. Scotty asked, can you explain a little bit more about your use of cardboard?
My use of cardboard? Okay. When I decided to quit using plastic mulch, I decided to stop using inversion tillage altogether, which included any type of like plows or harrows or anything that turns or inverts the soil. So I moved towards using rotary implements. I bought a BCS walk behind tractor for my garden plot maintenance. And so the only thing I use now is a power harrow, which tills, horizontally versus vertically and doesn't create a hard pan. And so I use that, and I only disturb the top 1/2 inch to 3/4 of soil. It just depends on what type of seed I'm planting now. So what I do, and I have a rotary plow. If you've read or looked at anything Jean-Martin Fortier does, he uses a rotary plow for several things: potato production, bed formation, so on and so forth. But one of the great things I picked up from him was his discussions about mulching your walking paths and letting that decay over a season. And then you take this rotary plow and flip it into the beds. But the cardboard serves as the foundation. So when you're doing your walking paths, I put that cardboard down in my walking path to serve as a weed barrier. And then I put mulch on top of that. And over the season, I actually, whenever I have a nitrogen-rich source of material, such as chicken manure or blood or anything, sometimes I will actually amend them with blood meal and some limestone. But I put that in my walking paths, and I allow that decomposition, that initial year of decomposition to happen in my walking paths before I turn that over onto my beds. And then once it is on my beds, I don't incorporate it into the soil profile. So it's just kind of like acting like a lasagna method. So you can also use cardboard to put in your beds before you flip the soil on top of them. And you want to use cardboard that doesn't have glossy ink. That's rule number one. When you look at National Organic Program guidelines on allowable inputs, you'll notice that cardboard's there. But it can't be glossy, and you have to remove the tape off of it, or else the tape will be there indefinitely. So I just use it as a weed barrier. I use it as a weed barrier around my trees and shrubs that I plant. I use it as a weed barrier in flower beds, vegetable beds. Anything I'm doing, the first step is cardboard. Earthworms love it. It breaks down readily. When you put cardboard down and then you put biologically active materials on top of it, such as compost with wood chips or anything like that, it's gone within a month. Like, you can dig down and it's just not there. And by that point, the seeds that are in that part of the seed bank are buried. They don't germinate. Perennial weeds are basically the only types of things that you deal with at that point, and that's just one of those things you got to stay on top of, and just keep them pulled. All of my beds now are permanent beds, all of my production beds, and I'm either growing, either they're covered in mulch, or I'm growing covered crops, or there's something on top of that. It's just, I'm working really hard to eliminate bare soil on the farm, and working on less and less tillage each season. Every time I do something, that's like one of the first things I ask myself: how can I achieve this task with as little tillage as possible, and just not disturbing the soil? And it seems as if over the last few years, several years now, I guess, of working in this direction, really starting to see significant gains and much more stable of an environment. My life is much less crazy because it's not like, oh my God, I got this happening, or oh my God, I got this happening, or whatever. I didn't water today, so everything's going to shrivel up and die. Once you start stabilizing this growing environment or production environment. And in pasture-based systems, I realize I've mostly dealt with vegetables, but in pasture-based systems, you know, you're going to create, if your goal is to produce beef, then you can create your circle with beef, and rotationally grazed chickens and other animals behind the cows. You know, I have a producer, he loves the cow, sheep, chicken rotation because the cows will eat, you know, the upper portion, and then the goats come in and eat the lower portion. And then he brings in the chickens, and the chickens are feeding on microbes that are in the manure. And that's a really balanced system as well. Like I said, it's really just identifying, you know, what you have a demand for, and then basically, you know, tracing back that carbon. But cardboard is readily available everywhere, all over the place. You can get as much cardboard as you possibly need. Matter of fact, many places are happy to see you coming to get their cardboard.
We have a couple more questions if you go through them. But before that, Angie has asked, how many layers of cardboard are you using to smother perennial weeds and general annual weeds?
If you're dealing with trying to smother out perennial weeds, you're going to have to till that initial time, okay? And you're going to have to dig them out. Like it's tough work. Perennial weeds, you got to dig out, get them out, and then just stay on top of it. But it gets easier. You know, it's really hard at first to get on top of it, but if you can get on top of it and stay on top of it, it's much easier. And the thing is if the soil's happy, these weeds aren't going to be as prolific because, you know, they're serving a primary role in nature as well to keep the soil covered. That's the reason why we have the existence of very persistent weeds like Johnson grass and nutsedge and pigweed, you know, amaranth, which really truly isn't a weed, but can be considered a weed. You know, these things are so prolific and so hardy because they're trying to take care of Mother Earth and recover that soil as fast as possible. So if your soil's happy and your pH, you know, is where it needs to be, and your biodiversity is there, you know, your weed pressure is going to go down significantly over time. But yeah, you dig those perennial weeds out, put that cardboard down, get it mulched, and keep it covered from that point forward, and that weed pressure will all but go away. You might have birds that come in and drop some seeds or something, you know, the wind might blow in some things from surrounding areas, but it'll be very minimal as long as you stay on top of that. So hopefully that helps.
We've got another question about when you stopped mowing your vegetable fields, did you see an increase in weeds in your beds?
So it's not that I stopped mowing the vegetable fields necessarily. It's my production areas are pretty well managed. Weeds can be dealt with pretty easily. I mean, to me, they can. So if I come into an area and I mow and then I you know, have to disturb it with my power harrow or rotary tiller or whatever, and then I put down the cardboard and some mulch, like there is no weeds for the most part. And any weeds there is, they're not deeply rooted in like clay soil or heavy soil. They're rooted in the upper layer of mulch. So it's very easy to take some sort of hand implement or tool and just come across and knock them up. But you know, you're always going to have that initial flush of weeds. This is a long-term management approach. It's not a one and done. I can do this. See, that's another difference between linear systems and regenerative systems. Once you develop a plot, you're not going to let that plot come out of development or care or maintenance. That's the thing about it. And so that's where this conception of, well, if I do that, you know, I'm going to constantly have weed problems year after year after year. Well, if the soil is biodiverse enough, then you don't have to repeat these linear techniques year over year over year. you're going to come off your warm season production, and your soil is going to be healthy enough to go roll right into cool season production, or you cover it with a crop that's going to provide shade and keep the soil covered, because once again, as long as that soil is covered, your weeds aren't going to be trying to grow as much. So it's, getting involved with regenerative agriculture and building these circular production systems. They're pretty constant. Instead of trying to renovate a whole plot year over year over year, and doing crop rotation and all this, you can follow. One thing I've learned from Dr. Elaine Ingram and the Soil Food Web School is that if the soil is biodiverse and you have biodiversity there, then pathogens for specific crops aren't going to develop as much. So actually, the more biodiverse that soil is, the lower the need for crop rotation and fallow periods, and like, just like with food safety stuff, you have critical times where your things can be susceptible to weed pressure or new seeds coming in, or those areas. So you really just have to hone in on that. And once you get a site developed, really maintain it and stay on top of it to keep the undesirable plants out. But one thing I've learned too is most weeds aren't actually weeds. So like amaranth was widely grown for 3,000 years by indigenous people as their primary grain crop. And you can see why. Amaranth produces, 500,000 seeds per plant. It wasn't until the Spanish explorers came over and classified that as a weed. And then from that point forward, it's considered a weed. My definition of a weed is any plant that's undesirable to an area, that's a weed. But it's all about perspective on that to a great deal. So maybe that helps some.
One more question before we wrap it up. From Laura, she said she found this absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much. She's curious about how you market your vegetable products, and if you could share more about your practices that include regenerative practices and also limited sprays, and then what the consumer reception has been.
Okay. So prior to this year, I've relied solely on farmers markets and restaurants up until the COVID thing. So COVID made it virtually impossible for me to plan crops for restaurants a season in advance, because you have no baseline to go on. They didn't know whether they're going to be open or closed. Didn't know what demand was going to be. And so I had no idea of how to plan crops accordingly. So I went to a solely direct consumer platform. I developed a barn-to-door website, used that to take online orders, and made deliveries for the whole initial 6 to 8 months during COVID to market my products. The farmers market remained open, thankfully. So it's an open-air market. It's outdoors. So, we were all very careful in navigating our path there. So my products were going there. And then in June, I went to an ice machine to get ice to process chickens. And there was a little building there, and it was about 350 square feet. And it's actually where I'm sitting right now. I rented this space. It's $450 a month, but it's a very high traffic area. The hospital is right across the street. We received great support from the community, and I began working with other farms. So now it's my farm. I work with BioWay Farms, Crescent Farms, Sylvan Farms, Watsonia Farms, and those are just the certified organic other ones I work with within 40 miles of Greenwood. So I'm very fortunate to have that access. And City Roots, I work with them too, but they're a little bit further away. They're about 52 miles from here, but that's not that bad. And so I work with them, and that's how I basically now plan my crops around my other farms' production gaps. And so I've lowered the amount of things that I'm doing on my farm in order to enable community outreach and to form this cooperative. I work with about 10 other farms that aren't certified organic, but are either producing organically or regeneratively. They're just good people doing good things, and it's my purview to provide the knowledge and outreach to guide them through the organic certification process, to introduce them to our certifier, Jill Robinson at Clemson. Her and Sandy Verderame do very good work there, and all the other people involved there. And with the Department of Agriculture, a lot of people think organic certification is so expensive. Well, it can be, but in South Carolina, Clemson and the Department of Ag have partnered up, and so we have a grant program where it essentially only costs $250 your first year for certification. So some of the other regenerative practices that I'm engaged in, hopefully that answers that part of the marketing question. And if anybody, and also, so now we've moved locations to a central location on Maxwell Avenue here in Greenwood, much more higher traffic area, a lot more foot traffic and stuff as well. But if you have value added products or anything else that you would like to be on a store shelf, please contact me. And we'll be more than happy to investigate the opportunities of partnerships. Certainly anybody watching this, I'm meeting new people and bringing new products in the store every day. It is my mission to do that now so that consumers don't have to go here, there, and yonder to get their local goods. They can come to one spot and get their things there. I work hard on highlighting the farms that I work with and talk about some of the things that they do. And I promote that stuff through my marketing channels. And hopefully it's having a good impact on their business and their reputations too. It's my purview to, if I had it my way, I'd have every product available in South Carolina in my store today. But it takes a lot of time to set up these things. But that's my mission is to bring as many local products as I can to our store. And we have an online store. So value added products, one great thing about them, number one, they're storable. They have a longer shelf life. Number two, you can ship them fairly cheaply. So through online marketing, your market is limitless as far as like right now during the holidays and gift baskets and ways to market those things. It's limitless. You can overload yourself very quickly if you're not careful. And then we're trying to have an organic development of this and just talk to people constantly and see where that path leads us. Regenerative production on the farm. I have a $16,000 greenhouse that I built from scratch for propagating, and I've not used it very much at all. And that's a very expensive, hard lesson learned. So one regenerative thing that I do in propagating is to not use carbon to heat or cool a greenhouse and fans and that energy involved in that process. I propagate things in the shade now, natural shade in the woods. And so like I'll do, a set of blueberry plants or a set of blackberry plants or a set of any kind of plants. And I, keep them there in the woods and like do my propagation there. And if something gets infested with a disease or dies or whatever, I just rely on natural selection. I'll take the ones that survive and the ones that are hardy and the ones that are do good and begin to propagate them more. So that's one aspect there. The other one is, with the laying hens, we're getting compost, we're getting eggs, we're getting our broiler chickens, and we're also selling baby chicks, which is a huge market. My rabbits. So, The rabbits that I'm raising out for meat go in rabbit tractors. My breeding stock does stay in cages. I give them fallow periods though, where they can have relief from that. But they're feeding my vermicompost beds. So I actually grow some timothy and some clover to feed that system and offset the food costs of the rabbits, and keep that as low as possible. I'm also a New Country Organics feed supplier. My old feed price list is actually right behind my head back here. So I've done that to lower my feed costs and supply other people with feed that's organic feed that's lower than the price of the organic feed at Tractor Supply. That's my purview, is to just beat the other guys, and provide good stuff. So the rabbits, worms, and that system is a regenerative system because all of that then goes into my growing beds. And so I've got multiple different sources of compost. So the compost from the chickens is naturally higher in nitrogen and phosphorus from the chicken manure, and ammonium from the manure. And then the product that comes from a vermicompost bed is much higher in humic acids and has more mycorrhizal and beneficial microorganisms. And then I combine the two together, put them in the beds. That helps speed up the decomposition of the mulch that's out there. Once those microorganisms begin feeding on that mulch on the top layers, they'll break it down fairly quickly. A lot of people have a misconception about mulch and it tying up your nitrogen in the soil, or organic matter in general, or carbon sources in general. Well, that's true if you incorporate it. But as long as you don't incorporate it, and just layer it season over season, so you had the questions about weeds. So, if you put a layer of mulch on, at one point in time, and then you come back and you put some on top of that, then any seeds that fell on top of the previous layer and then are there covered more than likely won't germinate. So there's that added benefit of stacking materials and using the lasagna method. I aerate all my beds using a broad fork just prior to planting. When I'm I put my compost on, and then I broad fork, and it sort of aerates the soil and introduces those microbes a little bit further down into the soil profile without disturbing what's already there. So that's my small way of incorporation. On a larger scale, if you're doing multiple acres, there's rotovators that do the same thing that a broad fork will do on a more commercial size scale, and larger power harrows that hook to a 3-point hitch stuff. So the entire process is scalable. It just depends on what your goals are and what your needs are there. So hopefully that answered that question pretty well. We do experimental crops with completely no-till situations and things, and I collect data, and I'm just learning each and every season. I learn something new, what plants work well with others. The books, carrots love tomatoes, and there's vegetable guides to companion planting. And so getting these things and just kind of experimenting and learning what works well in your area. Don't put too much faith in the videos and market gardening things you see online, and don't try to imitate those things specifically. Those production methods are catered and tailored to that geographic area. So while you may adopt some good concepts, some will work great, some won't work great. So I pick and choose from these people, what I use. When looking at, people like Elliot Coleman and Justin Rhodes and Jean-Martin Fortier and Curtis Stone and all these people, they're, and Gabe Brown, they're all just in very different areas. But you can pick up on small snippets and bring them back to your area and try them out, and they work. And so that's kind of what I've been doing. And that's part of learning your circle. That's the whole concept there of learning your circle. Not every circle is the same. Nobody, in fact, nobody's circle is going to be the same. But it's just observing these patterns in nature, learning where you can step in and help process this carbon and make positive changes for your soil. And looking at the clock, I see it's 11. So if we got time to answer more questions, I'll do it. If not, I understand. We could talk about this for days.
Thanks so much, Will, and thank you everyone for your questions. And if you have any more, you can reach out to Will through the app, or if we can share your email and people have questions, then
absolutely, yeah. Share my information. Anything you need, I'm open to questions all the time. That's how I meet people and learn new things.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. Happy anniversary. Happy birthday to your wife. And thank you everyone for joining us.
All right. Y'all have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.